Hi, Kai.
Hi, Ron. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Doing okay.
Good.
Doing okay.
Today's meeting, we have to discuss or we have to find common ground,
hmm
uh, and we have to approach that. So, how do we find this common ground in a digital universe?
I think we have to meet like somewhere in the middle in the digital universe. We just pick a point. Like, what's the middle of the internet? Can we meet in that area somehow?
I'm not aware of any.
I didn't know there was a beginning or an end, but I'm sure if there is, there's some type of middle somewhere, I imagine.
Probably, yeah.
Well, I think I don't know. Like, kind of thinking back to our last conversations, we were kind of I think we were looking at your last show and talking about the kind of the beauty and the intersections of like looking at those habited spaces and looking at the idea of taking an architectural space and kind of thinking about the idea of isolation and thinking about the idea of like the reassessment of value and where we are and how intimacy works and how isolation works and building into that space. And then I think you really kind of hit the nail on the head when you use that space to kind of talk about COVID. It seemed like such an appropriate place to turn to when you're looking at others who have historically kind of gone through that. And as you mentioned too, there was ties to an earlier pandemic in it as well. So I don't know, I guess that kind of made me think about crossover for me in relation to you. And I think in some way, when I'm building space or when I'm building objects or if I'm building anything in this kind of like digital vacuum space, I kind of in the same way am looking for those kind of spaces of intersection and looking for those spaces for things to meet and kind of grow and generate in. Um, so I think maybe as like an initial launching point, we could think about the idea of trying to either forge a space, create a space in which we kind of both build into. We could propose individual spaces for each other that we could both consider and recollect on and kind of figure out what we could do. We could think about the idea of looking at pre-existing spaces in the world and come up with proposals for intervening in that space or building into that space. Um, I don't know. That was like just some of my like original thoughts is about like trying to actually find like either a physical or digital space to actually try to intersect and work within,
Uh-huh.
or the idea of like disregarding that completely and then thinking about like the absence of space and thinking about like the complete removal of like context and history and just like building something in a vacuum.
Uh-huh. I think what's interesting now that due to this pandemic, we are dealing with a space, with an infinite space
Mm-hmm.
that physically we can never access. So we are dealing with something that could be ideal and
Mm-hmm.
something that is um, could be the most dangerous idea or the safest because you can never access it. As in, you can never physically access it unless you build it in actual space.
Right.
And I don't know if we should propose new spaces or analyze existing ones. I don't know what you are interested in at the moment. As in, I know you create spaces that maybe are new but take form in something that we are already familiar with. I don't know maybe what
Mm-hmm.
is your practice at the moment, because we can maybe jump on that, or maybe we can do something in parallel with that. Um, so that I think it is quite interesting to see our interests at this point and and go with them. So it would be more organic rather than forcing some
Mm-hmm.
extra something new.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think I don't know. I guess I'm also kind of considering the idea that, I think arguably either of us do not build spaces in our work, but I think that we build into spaces. Like we're
Mm.
not building the architecture, we're building objects that exist within the context of an environment or habit an entire area, or like kind of deal with the kind of the language or the context or the history or the culture of that space somehow. Whether that's either like a imitated space or whether it's a pre-existing space or an artificial space. Um, and I think what I'm just bringing up is that I think you and I both build objects,
Uh-huh.
and not necessarily subjects. And I think that if we could either, we could find a location for objects to go into, um, whether we imagine it or whether we look for it. Or I guess the other way around it is, we could also build objects and then figure out like the space afterwards, if that makes sense. Like what I think is really interesting about some of your work is, not necessarily your last show, but maybe something earlier where like if you have a work and you have a piece that you made, whether it has a historical or contextual reference, um, if you put it in a gallery, it's just a neutral setting, right? It's literally just a white cube where you like all of that context and history revolves around just trying to understand the objects through its narrative. But
Mm-hmm.
it's not necessarily the room that it's in, or it's not necessarily the environment it's in, because like the gallery is there just to be this neutral backdrop for it to exist.
Uh-huh.
Um, so we could also think about the idea of like, if we build an object, what would be like the ideal space for it to be in, or like what would be the idealized context or setting or environment for it to be placed in, if that makes sense.
Usually I work the other way around. Like I
Mm,
am aware of the space
yeah.
and I I build within it literally. I mean, both in a literal sense and a metaphorical sense.
Mm,
Um, but you are right in the sense that when uh, when showing things in a gallery, it is quite a neutral space, and I think it also relates to almost building in an infinite space or in
hmm. Right.
it's something um, for the past 100 years all the galleries have aimed at being a white cube space,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
which is almost contextless unless
Yeah.
the only context you would regard is the gallery itself.
Right.
Um,
Right.
I don't know where I'm going with this thought.
Well, it's interesting. So I think you're totally right. I remember, so when I was in school, one thing that I was like really trying to figure out and study a lot was linear perspective, and I was just like really fascinated by the idea of linear perspective and the kind of like the technological developments of it. And I was
Mhm.
reading a book by Erwin Panofsky, and he said something really brilliant, which I always stood with me, is that linear perspective is really just a slice. Like if you make like an image using linear perspective, it's really just like a slice out of something infinite, right? It's like those points recede in space forever. And really
Uh-huh.
like the picture plane is just like a cut of that, right? It just like slices that infinite space. So I kind of
Uh-huh.
like how you're talking about the idea of like the gallery walls are there, but really it's like that space just goes on forever. They just decided that they're going to put up some partitions and put lighting on there to like optimize the viewing quality of it, but like it literally it is like a non-space, in a really
Uh-huh.
interesting way. It's really just a framing device around the object itself, but it
Uh-huh.
seems kind of arbitrary. It's just like a purely aesthetic, decision to like say, okay, the wall's here, so this can hang on it, and then the object can exist in front of it, which I think is really funny. Yeah, and I don't know. It's I guess what's really interesting about this conversation right now is the idea that there's like space and non-space at the same time right now. So it's like there we have a newfound interaction with space because we have this incredibly close, intimate space that we're confined to, right? We have like this social distancing space of like 6 feet apart from everybody else. So we almost have like this like confined bubble around us. And then we kind of have this like theoretical space where it's like the actual physical space in the world is uninhabited right now, or it's like, I don't know what the word would be, not sedated, but you know, there's like no one's out in the streets anymore in a way that it used to be. And because of that, there's this kind of regeneration of like the natural world where it's like jellyfish coming in the Venice canals, you know, like, that kind of really strange, like, you know, like nature feels like it's kind of like taking back over and like the environment is rechanging. So there's like space on that level too, which I think is really weird. So like we have just this completely new assessment of how we're supposed to relate to ourselves and then to the rest of the world. And I don't know, I think what's interesting too, like thinking about your work is and correct me if I'm wrong, like all of the space and scale and size of your work, like it relates to the human body, right? Like
Yes.
very specifically. So like you understand it and you're able to perceive of it because it is like very intentionally somehow a tool that relates exactly to the portions of
Yes.
like what we're supposed to work in. And so it also kind of makes me think about like the dimensions of ourself and our space in the world of where we are now, like the potential of like what would happen if like the Sartre dagger is like 5,000 feet big, you know, like all of a sudden there's like potential for things to exist in a totally different environment and context, and like what does that then mean and how does that change? And I guess yeah, I don't know, I'm not sure entirely where I'm going with that, but that's just like some type of thing I remember when I was going through your website and looking at all of these things. The thing that really struck me was like they feel they really feel like they have such a strong relationship to the body as far as like the scale and the functionality of everything that exists.
Yeah, yes, that is, I think, very important for me.
Mm,
I somehow I think I also create figurative work without the absence of the figure.
mm,
Um, so somehow I think it's my work is rather figurative because it is something that would wrap around the body or would accommodate the body, whether it's a hand, whether it is a head, or whether it is the whole body.
mm.
So yes, that element of space, the bodies we have, and the space we occupy is very important for me, and
Mm.
which brings us to the question, if we occupy space in a digital in this space, whether
Right.
this is tangible, whether it is relevant. I don't know. I don't know where to go.
It's a really difficult question. Do you feel like you've made an adjustment in the way that you think about objects in relationship to the human body? Like, has that changed differently? Has scale changed differently for you now? Like, because we are all asked to like work in different like confines that we're not used to?
I'm rather hard-headed. Um, like I don't think this anything would replace sculpture.
Yeah.
I don't think that it's not the option of finding new solutions to for instance to painting or to sculpture or experiencing them. It's not um, it's not finding solutions, it's just creating something else. And this hasn't really I don't know, changed the way I think, because I
Mm.
still think in terms of this physical space. However, I am intrigued to find new ways of uh, of experiencing or doing an artwork. But it's not like, okay, we cannot access it physically, so we have to see the next best thing. It's not like that. It's just like when, I don't know, like when television was invented, or on video, like it is a new medium, and so it's a finding new ways of exploring that.
That's wonderful. I like how you're talking about that. It makes me think about like Rosalind Krauss really famously, I think in the 70s, she proposed to all of these land artists who were making work this idea of making a semiotic square for like how to think about new opportunities. And it's the idea of like you create an axis system and then you figure out like what's in between. So for instance, like on like the x-axis you would say like here's space and here's non-space, right? So like you have polar opposites, and then on the y-axis going the other way you say like here's object and non-object going the other way, right? And so you have this
Uh-huh.
like coordinate system. But then the trick from that point is like, okay, so if here's object and here's space, like what is object in space? And then on the opposite is like, what is non-object and non-space? What
Hmm.
is like object and non-space? And then what is space non-object? So you like all of a sudden you have these four options that you've never really considered that you have to like try to place yourself into. And it's like, I don't actually know what non-object, non-space is, like that kind of thing. Um, that could be like a really fun um exercise that we give each other or something
Yes,
to like
yes.
get the wheels turning or something like that.
I think I've already sketched the activity, and it sounds so absurd to me that it's so interesting.
Yeah, and it's fun too because you can also like, you know, like those are just two like fast examples, but then you can also say like, okay, so I figured like what object is in relationship to space, but like let's take like object now and bring it into, I don't know, like politics or something social, and say like what's political,
Mm.
apolitical, and object and
Uh-huh.
non-object, you know. So you can kind of like use it as a way to like keep refining and keep like getting to something that's like more and more precise.
Uh-huh.
um but then again, like the funny thing is like it all becomes so theoretical that
Yeah,
then you kind of end up with this like note and you're like, okay, I guess this is where I'm supposed to end up, and then you're like, what do I actually make, you know? Like it's a really funny thing.
yeah.
What I've noticed in like listening to news and podcasts, that like the world is just like increasingly theoretical right now because we're just like stuck at home thinking
Yeah.
about the world in a way that we've never had before. So like
Uh-huh. We're
maybe
doing less, so we're thinking more.
yeah. Right, totally. So like maybe there's something really interesting about that too, that maybe it is the time to think about things that like can't exist but do exist, or the other way around, I don't know.
And I think on that note, I think we should think and sketch this out and catch up next week.